She was just 9 years old, a bright, innocent little girl who should have had her whole life ahead of her. But on a November night in 2007, Rowan Ford vanished from her home in a small Missouri town. What started as a desperate search for a missing child soon turned into an investigation that revealed horrifying secrets and ultimate betrayal. What happened to Rowan Ford, and who is responsible for taking away her young life? Rowan Ford was a bright, kind-hearted girl who brought joy to everyone around her. Born on April 11, 1998 in San Diego, California, she faced early life changes when her parents divorced. Her mother, Colleen, moved them to the small town of Stella, Missouri, where she later married a man named David. In this new family, Rowan had 2 sisters and 2 brothers, creating a tight-knit bond among them. She cherished her time outdoors, riding her bike, swimming, and expressing her creativity through drawing. On November 2, 2007, when Rowan was just 9 years old, her sudden disappearance sent shockwaves through the community. Colleen worked night shifts at a local store, while her husband, David, spent most of his days on the farm. This often left Rowan, their independent young daughter, to look after herself. On November 2, Rowan stayed home alone as usual. The next morning, around 9 a.m., Colleen returned from work to find Rowan's room empty. Concerned, she asked David where Rowan was. David claimed that Rowan had asked to sleep over at a friend's house, and he had allowed it, given the trust and close-knit nature of their small town. As Colleen's worry grew, she began checking with all of Rowan's friends, quickly discovering that none of them had seen her or hosted her for the night. Growing increasingly anxious, Colleen searched the entire town but found no trace of her daughter. Frustrated with the lack of progress, she urged David to call the police and report Rowan missing. When David reassured her that Rowan would return soon, Colleen decided to take matters into her own hands and dialed 911. The local sheriff swiftly organized a search operation and went to speak with David, the last person to see Rowan. David explained that he had spent the evening with his colleague Christopher and mutual friend Nathan, drinking and playing pool at his house. Later, they headed to Christopher's trailer, stopping for more alcohol along the way. David said he had checked on Rowan, who was asleep, before leaving. After a continued drinking session at Christopher's trailer, David asked Nathan to drive him home. To avoid the police, Nathan took back roads. Once home, David claimed he went straight to bed, only to be woken by Rowan asking to sleep over at a friend's house. He agreed, and then fell back asleep. The police approached David's story with skepticism. It seemed unlikely that a 9-year-old would leave for a friend's house in the middle of the night without supervision. Suspecting that David might be hiding something or directly involved in Rowan's disappearance, the sheriff continued the search well into the night. The small town of Stella, with its tight-knit community of 150 people, quickly banded together to help. News of Rowan's disappearance spread rapidly, and the entire community was determined to find her. The first day of searching turned up empty-handed, intensifying the urgency. On November 4th, police visited the neighboring town to speak with Christopher. He supported David's account but mentioned that he hadn't heard from David since that night and had only just learned about Rowan's disappearance. The search effort was ramped up with more volunteers, yet still, there was no sign of Rowan or any clues to her whereabouts. The following day, the FBI joined the investigation, adding resources while the local police continued their efforts. Detectives started considering the possibility of abduction, casting doubts on David's increasingly dubious story. Conversations with all of Rowan's friends confirmed she hadn't visited them that night. Meanwhile, David's story kept changing, raising more suspicion. He provided conflicting timelines and even suggested that Rowan might have left without his knowledge. FBI agents unearthed a significant detail. David had borrowed his mother's car on the night of Rowan's disappearance, a fact he had initially concealed. They seized both the borrowed car and his own pickup truck for examination, though no evidence was found. Detectives turned their attention back to Christopher and Nathan, who had been with David that evening. Christopher repeated his story and underwent a polygraph test, which showed no signs of deception. However, after leaving the station, Christopher flagged down Sheriff Clark, a familiar and trusted figure from his childhood. During their discussion, Sheriff Clark sensed that Christopher was hiding something. Clark relayed his suspicions to the FBI, who believed Christopher might have critical information implicating David. Given his close relationship with Christopher, Clark offered to persuade him to talk. Later that evening, Christopher visited Colleen's house to check on the search progress. It was then, with FBI agents present, that Christopher's behavior hinted at deeper knowledge of the events. Christopher stuck to his story, but for the first time, didn't rule out David's involvement. Eager to uncover the truth, he even suggested wearing a wire to coax a confession from David. However, detectives decided against this plan and instead asked if he knew of any locations where Rowan's body might be hidden. Christopher provided several potential sites, and, the next morning, police set out to search them. Despite their efforts, the FBI's questioning of David continued to yield denials, and a search of his home turned up no leads. Meanwhile, Christopher visited the sheriff's office to discuss his concerns with Sheriff Clark. During his encounter with the FBI, Sheriff Clark couldn't shake the feeling that Christopher was still holding back crucial information. After their meeting, he contacted the detectives, expressing his belief that Christopher might have key details implicating David in Rowan's disappearance. The FBI agents asked Sheriff Clark to continue persuading Christopher to talk, convinced that he wanted to share important information but was too afraid to do so. On November 7th, police summoned Christopher back to the station to seek his consent to search his safe at David's house. Having lived with David for several months, some of Christopher's belongings were still there. He agreed to the search and allowed the police to also search his trailer and car, voluntarily providing a DNA sample and agreeing to answer further questions. During this interrogation, Christopher unexpectedly admitted that David's story was not entirely accurate. As investigators pushed for details, Christopher became agitated, insisting that he would not continue the conversation if treated like a criminal. This led to the detectives ending the interrogation, and Christopher left the station. Later that evening, Christopher approached Sheriff Clark, voicing his frustration with the detective's treatment and contemplating hiring a lawyer. Sheriff Clark acknowledged Christopher's right to legal representation but stressed the urgency of finding Rowan. Christopher, overwhelmed with emotion, insisted he would only speak with Clark and began to cry, expressing his deep bond with Rowan. Just as Christopher was on the verge of revealing critical information, a distraction at the station caused him to leave without disclosing what he knew. Sheriff Clark relayed the conversation to the FBI, suggesting they give Christopher time to think. The search for Rowan continued, and on November 9th, a week after her disappearance, search teams made a grim discovery. Rowan's body was found in a remote area near Powell, concealed under leaves and debris, with clear signs of foul play. The FBI, hoping for a breakthrough, contacted Sheriff Clark. Christopher, now visibly distressed and fearing for his safety, reached out to Clark and expressed his concerns. Clark reassured him and brought him to the station, urging him to reveal everything now that the case was classified as a homicide. In tears, Christopher was finally prepared to disclose what David had done. Feeling there were too many people at the police station, Christopher suggested going to a quieter spot, a small bridge a few miles out of town. Sheriff Clark agreed, and they drove there together. Once they arrived, Christopher unexpectedly raised his hands, implying he should be handcuffed. The sheriff, surprised, said it wasn't necessary, but Christopher insisted, stating that what he was about to share would make it inevitable. Christopher began to recount the events of that night. He, Nathan, and David had been drinking at his trailer. Later, David and Nathan left, taking the back roads to avoid the police. However, Christopher then revealed his heinous plan. He admitted to driving directly to David's house, entering Rowan's room, and carrying her to his car without waking her. He took her to his trailer, where he committed his crime. When Rowan woke up and tried to resist, she couldn't break free. After the crime, He planned to take her back home, but she recognized him, leading him to take her precious life. He drove around until he remembered a large pit near a neighboring town. He placed her there and tried to cover her with branches. Back at the trailer, he found traces of evidence on his clothes and mattress. He gathered these items and placed them in a large barrel, intending to dispose of them discreetly. Sheriff Clark was stunned by Christopher's confession. He had always believed David was responsible and thought Christopher was just withholding information. Knowing Christopher for nearly 20 years, the sheriff struggled to reconcile this with the man he thought he knew. Christopher, who had 3 young children, had always seemed like a decent man. After completing his story, Christopher agreed to go to the station without handcuffs. At the station, he repeated his confession to the FBI agents and was arrested. He also consented to a search of his trailer and car, expressing deep regret for his actions. Upon hearing Christopher's confession, detectives immediately informed David. Given David's odd behavior and inconsistent statements, they suspected he might be shielding his friend. However, during questioning, David dramatically changed his story. He claimed that upon returning home and discovering Rowan missing, he suspected Christopher and drove to his trailer. There, he found Christopher with Rowan and decided to participate in the assault. Afterward, he assisted Christopher in disposing of the body. David added that his mind had shut off during the ordeal, and he remembered nothing for several days. Detectives, taken aback by this twist, sought confirmation from Christopher. Yet, Christopher maintained that David was not involved, sticking to his initial version of events. This left investigators perplexed, though Christopher's account aligned with the evidence. Medical experts confirmed that Rowan had been strangled with a thin rope, a detail only the perpetrator would know. During the search of Christopher's trailer, police found a barrel with ashes and hair similar to Rowan's in his car. Despite the uncertainty about whose version of events was truthful, both men made incriminating statements, leading to David's arrest and the case proceeding to court.
Today, the two appeared in court in Cassville in Berry County, Missouri. The two were arrested on Monday, 3 days after Rowan Ford's body was found about 10 miles from her home. According to investigators, both men have admitted taking part in the crime, but today in court entered pleas of not guilty. Today, Spears and Collins were heavily guarded, wearing both wrist and leg shackles. Ford's mother, Colleen Spears, was also in court today, joined by several family members. While many in the community of Stella continue to grieve and hope for justice, they did not attend court proceedings this morning.
I wanted to, but my heart wouldn't let me. I didn't want to go over there and look at those two guys.
During the trial, Christopher sought to exclude his statements, claiming he didn't know they could be used against him and that his rights were violated. However, the judge denied this motion, as all conversations had been voluntary. Christopher also tried to mitigate his actions by highlighting his difficult childhood and developmental issues, but this didn't lessen his punishment. In 2012, 5 years after the murder, he was sentenced to death, and his appeals were unsuccessful. David's situation proved to be more complex. He confessed to assaulting and killing Rowan, but his account conflicted with Christopher's statements. Charging David with murder carried the risk of potentially overturning Christopher's sentence, as there was no concrete evidence, such as DNA against David. To avoid this risk, the prosecution reduced David's charges to child endangerment and obstruction of justice. As a result, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison with a minimum of 5 years to be served. The sentence caused public outrage, with many believing it did not match the severity of the crime. Christopher Collins' fate was sealed when the United States Supreme Court denied his appeal and Governor Mike Parson refused his clemency request. On December 3, 2024 at 5:54 p.m., the execution witnesses, including members of Christopher's legal team, media representatives, state witnesses, and family representatives, were moved into place. At 6 p.m., Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey confirmed there were no legal challenges to proceeding with the execution. 9 minutes later, 49-year-old Christopher Collins was declared dead. In his final statement, Christopher expressed remorse and hoped for closure for those he had hurt, praying for all involved. The impact of Rowan's murder was deeply felt. One of her teachers, Todd Holt, who testified at the trial, struggled to clear out her desk for a long time after her death. He remembered Rowan as a dedicated student, always eager to work and get ahead in life. Rowan's best friend, Tyler, found comfort in their friendship, with Rowan's calm personality balancing his energy. Tyler's mother described the loss as the closest thing to losing her own child. Rowan's older sister continued to hold on to the memories and love for Rowan, feeling a part of herself had died with her sister. Rowan's case left a lasting impact on the small town of Stella and beyond. Her story serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers that sometimes hide in plain sight. In her memory, efforts have been made to strengthen protections for children and to raise awareness. Rowan should have had the chance to grow up, to chase her dreams, and to live a full life. Though her story ended far too soon, she is not forgotten. It's never easy to recount such difficult events, but it's crucial that we give a voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. By keeping their memories alive, we honor their stories and the impact they had on the world. Thank you for watching this video and for joining me in remembering Rowan. Your support helps ensure that we never forget her and that we continue to seek justice for all victims of such tragic circumstances. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Until my next video, stay safe and look after your loved ones.